is a professor for sociology at the London School of Economics, and is also directing the LSE's International Inequalities Institute. So it's a big asset to have him as part of this webinar, but also as part of our project. So the project that this links to is called TSITICA, Transforming Social Inequalities Through Inclusive Climate Action. It's a really innovative project in the way that it brings together people who've never worked before and they need to think around questions that they haven't addressed before. And it gets everyone slightly beyond their comfort zone, but it really sparks new ideas. It is funded by the British GCRF, so thank you, GCRF. And it is part of the ARUA network. ARUA is the African Research University Alliance. And under this alliance that brings together, I think it's about 16 universities on the continent, there are a couple of centers of excellence, and 2 of those are hosted at the University of Cape Town, and they have their partners at the universities of Ghana and University of Nairobi in Kenya. And they bring together researchers who specialize in analyzing inequalities on the one hand, and others who specialize in understanding climate change in terms of its impacts, but also in terms of its causes. So we have a lot of learning to do in this project, and this seminar series, webinar series, is basically part of our learning. So we're presenting our work, we're presenting our methods, and we think about, okay, how does this relate to each other's work? So my name is Britta Renkamp. I work as a senior researcher at the African Climate and Development Initiative at UCT, and I'm the research coordinator on this project, and I'm really pleased to see all of you here. And we have about 90 minutes, so okay, let's say 84 left, 86 left. So Mike will just speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, and I invite you all to listen carefully and think about your questions. And there's no such thing as stupid questions. So we're all learning, we're all understanding, and part of this is really to get everybody on the same page and to understand the use of each other's work for the bigger outcome of the project. So with this, I would like to, Mike, to invite you to start, please.
Okay, thank you. Oops. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to give this talk. And I should say the focus today will be on the methods, because what I'll be talking about in substantive terms is a very particular study of the UK and looking at the experience of precarity. And I think it is an interesting study, and I'm happy to share with you some of the thoughts I have on the findings, but I'm really seeing this as a chance to reflect upon methods, methodological issues. And I should say that as part of my involvement in the Climate Change and Inequality Project, there's a little bit of money put aside for doing some qualitative work linked into the other research methods. So this is an opportunity for me to reflect upon how I've used mixed methods in previous work, and to kind of explore possible ways of understanding why they matter, and also how we can use them. Now, I suspect that the methods I used in this particular study won't work, but nonetheless, maybe some interesting lessons. So let me begin with some orientations. And I should also say that this paper, as will become clear later on, has been sitting on my laptop hard drive for a long time, and it's very good to get the opportunity to kind of brush it off and return to it. It has finally been published by the Journal of Chinese Sociology, of all places. So it's been very good to have to think about it. So look, I'm a mixed methods researcher. I love working with statisticians, but I'm not a statistician. I'm not an expert in quantitative methods. But most of my work does involve a quantitative component. I am in some ways much more at home in doing interviews and also documentary research and case study research. But for me, the really exciting possibility is about linking these methods together. And I'm as Britta mentioned, I've been director of the International Inequalities Institute at the LSE. One of the things which really comes out to me time and again is the mismatch between structural analyses of inequality, which show in many parts of the world, massive inequality, which has often been seen to be growing by numerous dimensions. So on the one hand, it's a very kind of bleak picture structurally about the rise of inequality and the extreme gap between rich and poor and such like. But the experiential dimension, it doesn't always match onto that. And this is my big theme today, actually, that how people see the world, how people understand their strategies, how they have aspirations and attitudes, does not map on to where they appear to fit in the inequality structure. And I think it matters hugely, because we need to understand better how people themselves experience inequality if we're to understand why they do certain things, why they make certain plans, and why they seek to find strategies to overcome disadvantage. This is really important, I think, with issues around climate change. Part of what we need to do is obviously map out the climate change challenge in different dimensions, but we also need to understand why are people on the ground in different kinds of structural situations adapting to it. How are they developing strategies for thinking about improving their own practices with respect to climate issues? And to do that, we need to understand better kind of how they navigate and how they experience their own situation, their own place in the class structure. So for me, trying to get qualitative and quantitative to speak to each other is very important, but it's often not straightforward to do that. So many of you will be familiar with debates about triangulation, and getting these different methods to basically speak the same story. I actually think, this will come out in what I'll be talking about, it's often a mismatch between what the quants tell us and what the qualitative material tells us, which is really interesting. And if we think hard enough about why we're getting mismatches, that can be very revealing of what is going on and how the experiential dimensions of inequality do speak to the structural issues. So I'm going to begin with a few general reflections on how I've tried to use quant and qual methods in some recent projects before I'm going to narrow in and focus on a particular study of the National Child Development Study, which is one of the most famous UK panel surveys, and discuss the lessons I've learned from using a small subsample, a number of qualitative interviews with a small subsample of that panel survey. Okay, so the first session and first 10 minutes is just, I just want to reflect upon how I have used qual methods and quant methods in the past. And I should say, I feel very comfortable with qualitative methods, with doing interviews and ethnographies. Oops. But there's a real problem, which is that often they don't really speak to the representative patterns which survey analysis and census-based analysis can reveal. That is to say that when we get a convenient sample, a small convenient sample, which we use for qualitative work, we often do it using stereotypes and images which may not be typical. And a classic way in which this operates in the UK is that when we are trying to do ethnographic studies or qualitative studies of kind of poor communities, we often head to particular areas which appear to fit the stereotypes of poverty or deprivation, without realizing that actually by focusing upon, say, on a geographical sampling strategy, we're perhaps missing the extent to which certain experiences don't easily map onto place or can't easily be mapped onto a subsample. So I've got really interested in thinking about how we do qualitative research by bouncing off some kind of survey instrument. It's kind of what I did. So I've got these two book covers here. Let me just say a few words about each of these studies. The first one, Culture Class Distinction, it's 10 years old now, but this was a big, well, it wasn't totally big. It was a nationally representative survey in the UK of people's cultural habits, leisure interests, everyday practices, also linked into their occupations, income. And this led to a very kind of rigorous analysis of cultural inequality in the UK. You know, I'm not singing my own praises, but it has become a standard work if you're interested in that. As part of what we did for that, we also, when we did the survey, we asked people, are you prepared to be interviewed in depth too? And quite a lot of people did. And so we also did about 40 interviews with a subsample of those who were in the nationally representative survey. And of course, that just allowed us, therefore, when we were using the individual in-depth accounts, we could place those people exactly in the wider representative patterns. And that gave us much more resonance, much more capacity to think about what they were telling us and how it fitted with where they were placed in our kind of model of cultural inequality, or what we call social space in Britain. That book is out there. Another model I briefly want to mention is something I did with the BBC about 7 or 8 years ago. This became quite, perhaps the word is notorious even, it was widely discussed. So the BBC 8 or 9 years ago asked me to develop a web survey, which they would host on their website about social class in Britain. And it was a lot of questions about economic capital, your friends, your social networks, but also your cultural interests. And we did that. And it did very well. Because the BBC is such a high profile media outlet, had got a very large take up from the audience. But because it was a web survey, so we had about 330,000 people doing it. 1 million people did this web survey, which is a vast number. But of course, being a BBC web survey, it was very, very skewed. And indeed, the skew was the most interesting thing about it, really. That basically, the more educated you were and the better off you were, the more likely you were to do it. And we found that we just were not picking up in the survey people who are in poor, deprived areas. And we could tell this by us comparing the distribution of the respondents with what we would find from other survey sources. So what we did, we had a team of ethnographers who basically went into some poor areas with the actual survey in their hands and basically talked it through with people in those situations and just had a more ethnographic discussion about why didn't you do this survey? What do you think about the results? And we used that ethnographic element to therefore, in a sense, elaborate the kind of take-up of the survey. And, you know, it was because it had been such a big media survey in the UK, it was quite interesting. In some middle-class households, people would say, oh, I remember it coming out. And they would then give their conversations and their comments about what they thought about it at the time. So it's quite nice in this situation to take a standard quantitative survey and actually take it into communities and talk through with respondents what they thought about it, what was missing. That was very revealing. It kind of is challenging the kind of divide with scientific experts doing the survey analysis and people, you know, not having their own voices. So you can see how those two projects are examples of how I've tried to use survey methods alongside in-depth qualitative methods. And since I've become director of the Inequality Institute at the LSE, I've become really, really interested in the paradox of inequality, which is discussed in all sorts of ways. But one of the major findings, which you find in economics and you find it in sociology, is that even though, you know, we social scientists normally think inequality is a huge problem, and it's a huge worrying challenge in the world, many, many people do not. And more than that, there seems to be an inverse relationship between the extent of inequality structurally and how far people actually think inequality is a problem. And with my colleague, Jonathan Mice, he's now at Harvard, he was at the LSE, we did this little project where Jonathan mapped out beliefs in meritocracy over time. The question here is, you know, success comes from hard work, which has been asked in UK Gallup surveys back to the 30s. So you have 80 or 90 years of information about how many people in Britain believe in meritocracy. And in this case, it's broken down by social class. And you can see many people, most of the time, do believe in meritocracy. You know, 3/4, even in the 70s, when it falls to its lowest level, 3/4 of people believe that, you know, success comes from hard work, which is not what social scientists normally think, if I'm honest, or certainly not sociologists. But more than that, you know, so that belief in meritocracy was really high in the 30s and 40s, when, you know, we absolutely know social mobility was really very limited. It actually, that belief in meritocracy declined at the time in the 70s and 80s, when social mobility increased in the UK, and then it's actually been increasing again. And if you look at the dark blue line for the working class, nearly 100%, nearly all working class respondents had the view that, you know, if you work hard, you're successful, which, you know, is sort of amazing. And if you compare that with the income shares in Britain, the share of the income taken by the top 10%, you can see it's an almost perfect inverse relationship, which is not kind of what you would expect. Well, you might expect that as inequality increases, as it does in Britain from the 1980s, quite radically, quite dramatically, before it levels off, that would actually lead to people being more skeptical about inequality. But in fact, the reverse has happened. And you find versions of this paradox, and Jonathan has shown, he's done a comparative analysis across much of the globe, and he basically finds that the more unequal countries have a greater belief in meritocracy than the more equal countries. So this is a kind of indication of a paradox, which I think, you know, we need to kind of reflect on how, you know, why is it the case that people do believe in, you know, meritocratic values, even though we know structurally that's not quite straightforward as that. And again, thinking about issues of climate change, you know, as climate scientists, we all know the world's in a desperate mess and things are not good. But does that view percolate through? How many people actually see it as important? I'm not familiar with the research on this. I mean, there will be some research, but this sort of analysis shows that many people probably don't see it as an overarching concern. And we need to understand why not, and what the reasoning is for that, if we're going to understand how we might change people's practices. So that's the big question for me. And today I just want to talk you through a particular project I've done, which is been trying to explore it. How do the most disadvantaged people in Britain narrate their life stories? How do they talk about themselves, where they fit, what their aspirations are, using qualitative material, which I think is better able to capture the experiential dimensions. More specifically than that, there's a whole series of arguments put forward by sociologists about why people in disadvantaged situations are not more radical, to put it in those terms. So Imogen Tyler has talked about the way people feel abject. Beverly Skeggs talks about the role of stigma, people being stigmatized or dominated. So can we see these people as almost hopeless, sense of hope? You know, there's a kind of cultural poverty argument. People in the most deprived situations are just, they can't see beyond getting by on a daily basis, and therefore they don't have the intellectual resources or the cultural worldview to think longer term, if you like, or think more strategically. Alternatively, you know, is there a latent? So one of the arguments is that actually people do have a latent radicalism, even if they're in deprived situations. It's just that they're not getting the right degree of support or leadership from, you know, political parties or the media, which would encourage them to let that latent class awareness, that latent sense of where, you know, we are completely marginalized, that doesn't feed through into a conscious political perspective. And here again, the analogy of climate change is quite interesting. You know, is there a kind of way in which people who can think more reflexively about climate issues, if they get the right leadership? Okay, so let me talk you through the actual project now. And if anyone's interested, I do have a paper which I can happily share with you. Just email me afterwards. So the National Child Development Study is probably one of the world's most famous panel studies. Basically, what happened is in 1958, everyone in the UK born in a particular week in March was subject to a study which began with interviewing their parents. I've got this nice little diagram here which is prepared for me. So when these kids were born, 60 odd years ago. Amazing battery of interventions by nurses, by health workers. Parents were asked about, you know, how much interest they're taking in the schoolwork of kids. Lots of information from schools about things like free school meals. When they got, so the actual exam results have been linked to the individual records of the respondents, or the full family history has been recorded. So as you can see from these blue lines here, this has been repeated every few years. It only goes as far as 2004, but it is still very current. Full work histories. And then in more recent years, as the cohort has aged and become adult, increasing number of attitude questions about how they see the world, voting behaviour, psychological well-being indexes. So as you can see, this survey began very strongly oriented around medical issues and development issues, psychologists, social work, educational studies. As it's gone on and as the respondents have grown older, it's become more of an all-round social science panel survey. And, you know, it has become famous as one of the most significant in the world. So it was analysis of this panel survey, which is one of the major reasons why the link between mothers smoking when pregnant and subsequent health of children came out. And the response rate is still extremely strong because there's been a big effort to make sure the panel respondents keep on being members of the panel, and many of them feel proud they are part of this repeated panel survey. So it's still about over 10,000 respondents from an original, I think it was 15,000. But up till 2008, hardly any qualitative work had ever been done on this panel survey. So all the instruments were basically quantitative with a few exceptions. And therefore I, alongside, oops, if I can just go back, second bullet point here, alongside Andrew Miles and Jane Elliott and Sam Parsons, we made the case, well, wouldn't it be interesting to actually do some in-depth interviews with these people too? And that will allow us to link together this extensive material on panel, from the panel survey, with what they say about their lives. And we got some money to do that. So 220 interviews. It's a small, it's less than 5% of, it's about 2% of the respondents. So not very many, but yeah, it's quite a lot at the same time. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to link the interview material we had, very rich interview material, I'm going to talk about it in a little bit, with the panel survey. And the way we did this was we used a method called multiple correspondence analysis, which is a form of cluster analysis, closely affiliated to principal components analysis, to basically cluster the entire NCDS panel survey using a series of variables, which are just listed here. And because we're influenced by French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, we wanted to have measures of economic capital and cultural capital and link these together. We didn't want to give economic capital a primacy. We wanted to just have all these variables in the mix and see what the main clusters were and what the main inequalities are, which came out of the analysis. And this is kind of, and the great thing about MCA is it lends itself to these kind of visualizations where you can visually represent the clusters. And you can, there were two main axes which this cluster analysis produced. On the y-axis, the vertical axis, you get the characteristic separation between people with capital, people with resources at the top, and people with little resources at the bottom. And then on the x-axis, on the horizontal axis, you find a separation between people with lots and lots of money and people on the right-hand side versus people with more educational qualifications, more cultural capital in Bourdieu's terms on the left-hand side. This is exactly the kind of analysis which is very familiar to sociologists. We come across it time and again. Two axes of separation. The first is to do with ultimate advantage and disadvantage, but we can separate that out on the second axis. So it's kind of repeating what we sort of know. to just say, we always need to remind ourselves when we look at this kind of panel survey that we are looking at individuals who were born the same week. So age is not in here. These are all the same age. And when we did this analysis, we actually did this analysis 10 years ago now. So they were about 50 years old at the time. And then we did a cluster analysis on that MCA response. And we came up with 9 clusters where basically all the individuals in the panel survey were grouped into one of 9 groups according to how much economic and cultural capital they have. And as you can see, it's a mess, which is not unusual for this kind of perspective, but it did allow us to pull out 3 extreme clusters. So right at the bottom of this graph, you can see there's a group which we call the disenfranchised, who actually, for other purposes, we call the Precariat. Now, they'll be the group which I'll be talking about in a minute. At the top left is a group we find called the cultural elite, and the top right, a group we call the economic elite. Once we've done this cluster analysis, we could then pull out the in-depth interviews of respondents who had been placed in one of these clusters according to their responses to the panel survey. So we're using basically a cluster analysis of the entire panel survey to select individuals for detailed analysis in terms of their in-depth qualitative interview. So this is a kind of method which we used before, and I find it a very helpful way of using the qualitative material in a way which is systematically drawing a subsample from a wider representative analysis. Let me just, and having done that, we could then use all the tricks of the trade, if you like, of qualitative material to understand, why do people who are the most disadvantaged, why do they, feel certain things? How do they experience their situation? What do they say about their lives? And I'm going to talk you through some of the findings. But first, I just want to show you this little vignette we gave them. This is actually quite nice. I think this is one of my favourite pieces of the whole project. It's influenced by some psychologists. Psychologists got people again in-depth interviews to reflect upon how to represent your life. Use of visualizations, I think, it's a neat way of getting responses, because you're not relying upon people being, confident about talking or articulating things. It can be done across the entire distribution in a quite interesting way. And because it's a bit counterintuitive, we're not normally asked to do this. People often tick interesting things. So we asked everybody we did the in-depth interview with, if you had to represent your life through a diagram, which of these would it be? And then we got them to talk about it in the in-depth interview. And what is interesting is having done this, we mapped the different diagrams people chose according to where they fitted in the cluster analysis. And this graphic here is a neat example of what we found. And it is really interesting because it does conform to what we would expect, which is, if you look right at the top of this graph, the diagram which people ticked most regularly was the one pointing upwards. So these are indeed the most successful people in the panel survey, and the in-depth interview material with the people in that situation show a nice story of, oh, haven't I done well? If you go to the bottom, the most disadvantaged, you can find the exact opposite. So it kind of conforms. It gets interesting too if you look at the top right-hand side, the business elite. These are the people with lots of money, but a bit less education, but less cultural engagement. You get a story of these staircases, upward staircases. There's a bit on the left-hand side, but the one which interests me is the cultural elite, the top left-hand side. These are people who've been to university, well-educated, mostly professionals, so they're pretty well off. They're not, they're not super rich, but they're pretty well off. And they actually give a story of zigzags pointing downwards. So I always talk about this in terms of, that shows, kind of the ability of the cultural elite to kind of narrate a story in which, things could have been better. Zigzags, and the zigzag represents something happened in my life. It means you've got something to talk about. Ultimately, in this case, pointing downwards. What's really interesting is we got people some people wanted to draw their own diagrams. He said, I don't, you know, and we gave them that chance. He said, yeah, okay, you can, if one of these don't fit you, you can draw your own. So the economic elite drew these ones of, again, mostly pointing upwards, but as you can see, with a bit of variation about when the zigzags come. And the zigzag normally represents something happened in my life, which was important. So but what people are doing here is they want to tell you about their life, a particular thing which happened to them, which disrupted things. Or in the case of the right-hand one, it's sort of, they were up on an upward curve and then something happened and it's been flatlining since then. Interestingly, the Precariat mostly did not want to do their own diagrams, which is an interesting point in its own terms. People at the bottom mostly ticked one of the diagrams which they were given. When they did, interestingly, these two didn't conform. So basically, we did 20 out of the 220 interviews were with people in this Precariat class. 18 of them got one of the diagrams. The two who didn't gave these kind of wavy lines with one of them pointing upwards. Again, interesting. Again, this is a point of mismatch. You wouldn't expect people at the bottom to be having that kind of diagram. But again, the ones I really find fascinating are the cultural elite diagrams. You know, these are the intellectuals. And of course, they were more likely to want to do their own diagrams, which is a way of saying, you know, my life is so interesting that, you know, it has all these zigzags. I mean, some of them are really complicated. And you can just see these, certainly the bottom three here, you can just see incredibly lots of zigs, ups and downs. And the one at the bottom has even tried several diagrams before choosing one. So point one, from how I think we can use mixed methods, one of them is to say the form of what people say is really interesting. It's not just what they say, it's how they say it. So for me, these diagrams are kind of interesting because, not necessarily because, you know, of what they seem to be saying in terms of lives pointing up or down, but the way in which these things are drawn is revealing. And the fact that the cultural elite are much more keen to do their own diagrams, they're basically saying, look, I'm an intellectual, I know what this is about. I can do my own life diagram. I don't need to have 8 boxes put in front of me. Whereas the Precariat, by contrast, more likely to tick one of the boxes given to them by the researchers. So that itself is interesting, telling. Now, time's a bit short. I'm going to skip over this. Well, no, I'll quickly go over these. So what we also did, having taken these clusters, these 3 clusters, and as you can see, I'm missing out the middle one. The ones in the middle I'm missing out because they're not separated analytically. So we just, out of the 9 clusters we found, I'm only talking about the 3 extreme ones here. The disenfranchised, which is another word for the Precariat, business elite and the cultural elite. And the interesting thing is that you can find, when you analyse the panel survey, there are some interesting differences in what they say, but you know, sometimes not that great. So around issues of racism, not that great. On the whole, I think, as you can see, the survey responses here are sort of indicating that people are basically very trying to distance themselves from any kind of racist attitude. So the one on the right-hand side, I wouldn't want another race for my boss. Hardly anyone agrees with that. And on the face of it, people are saying, I'm happy to have another race for my boss. And there's a bit more variation with the, I wouldn't mind if another race moved in next door, wouldn't mind working with other races, but not much. On the other hand, attitudes to politics, and this is from 2009. So this is before Brexit. This is before, you know, what's happened, the rise of populism. But nonetheless, you find these very interesting findings, which is that none of the political parties would do anything to benefit me. You can see the Precariat, 40% support that view, much fewer of the elite, because the elite feel much more engaged with politics. On the right-hand side, not much difference which political parties in power. And again, the Precariat, over half of them. This, I should say, I'm currently talking about their responses to the panel survey, not the in-depth interviews. I'm just giving you a context about these cluster differences here. You know, interesting. This is interesting. This is kind of explaining, I think, some of the things which have happened in the UK in the last 10 years. That the Precariat feel no one's talking for me, no one is representing me. You know, they're feeling disengaged from politics. And that becomes even more clear when you talk about attitudes towards economic inequality or economic equity. Question, working people don't get a fair share of the nation's wealth. 2/3 of the Precariat say that. So that's a dominant view from people in those positions that, people like me are not getting a fair share of the economic produce of Britain. One law for the rich, another for the poor. As you can see, Precariat, over half believe that. Management always try to get the better employers, again, half. And here, interestingly, the cultural elite also turn out to be more liberal than do the business elite, which is not surprising given these attitudes towards economic equity. So these clusters do appear to map on to the panel survey responses. But I just want to talk in the last, what time is it? Try and finish in 10 minutes. Last bit, how this maps on to what they say in their lives using the in-depth interviews. So just to reiterate, I think one of the great values of this approach is that, we know the people we've chosen. We know where they fit according to their survey responses. So we're not just picking a convenience sample, which might just be reinforcing a prejudice about why we chose them in the first place. Which I think is always a danger with quantitative methods. And let me just begin with a few descriptives about them. So there's 20 of our 220 in-depth interviewees came from this cluster of people who were precarious, people who were at the bottom, the most disadvantaged of their cohort, of their panel. And this is some descriptives about, economic activity, occupations, pay. And the interesting thing here, and you can just browse through these responses, and apologies, the education qualifications won't mean much to you. It means national vocational qualification levels. But the point I just want to make is actually this does not conform to a standard, media political framing about the underclass. Because these are not people who are unemployed. These are not people who are living in public council housing, social housing. As you can see, nearly all of them, if you look at the bottom housing centre, nearly all of them own their own house. Nearly all of them are employed. And most of them have got some degree of education. The issue is just that they are in very badly paid, insecure jobs. So again, if we approach it from a quantitative point of view, I'm just aware of so many studies of poor, classic capture states. And those places exist, but the danger is, again, if we get the sample from this representative approach, you can say, well, in fact, it's a much more structural problem, which doesn't necessarily reinforce or confirm those stereotypes we have about poverty. Another interesting thing, which we're not expecting, I'm not sure, we may just have found some very strange interviews. But again, we would normally expect people who are disadvantaged to score really low or much lower than average on standard measures of well-being. And these are just, here we could actually extract from the panel survey their own responses to a series of metrics, which I'm not familiar with, if I'm honest, so I'm not going to go into details about them. The Edinburgh-Warwick Mental Wellbeing Scale, a malaise score, and then we got the NCDS responses as a whole. And in fact, the Precariat do not in this appear to come out badly. Our in-depth interviews did not come out badly. So 90% of the Precariat think they usually get what they want out of life, which is higher than the NCDS as a whole. So this is exactly what I'm talking about. The mismatch is interesting. These are people we know structurally are at the bottom, having a hard life. They're not well paid. Materially, they're amongst the poorest in the UK, and yet the actual survey responses do not appear to back that up. Now, again, it may just be that the 20 Precariat we happen to subsample are just really atypical, but nonetheless, interesting thing to think about more. We also had measures of social capital. Did they belong to voluntary associations? And the interesting point is here, again, we may just have had an untypical sample, but in fact, it's true, they drop out of voluntary associations in their 30s and 40s, but by age 50, many of them come back. certainly the men had. So they don't completely support the stereotype about disengagement either. What is interesting, I think, is kind of what they say about their position in society. And I just want to pull out a few themes. So one of the themes which sociologists talk about is the fact that people at the most marginal levels of British society, they just feel they're too scarred by class to talk about it. Like, so they don't have a class consciousness, because to own up to being working class or exploited or marginalised would be too personally upsetting. So instead, they try and pretend that, you know, class doesn't exist, that, you know, they're more respectable than you might imagine. What came out of the interviews? I'm only giving a few vignettes here, so I haven't got, but as I say, I have a paper which I can pass on to anyone interested. That's certainly not the case. Pretty much all the 20 people we talked about were absolutely clear that they were at the bottom of the pile. There were no doubt at all that they were, you know, structurally, they had a very hard time. It's just that they didn't think that was about social class. So this person is saying, yeah, I've been brought up in a working class family, but now I don't think any of us feel we are working class today. I've always felt like I belong with them as the siblings. I don't feel anything else really. This person says, at one stage, I suppose when I was younger, I always saw myself as working class. Now my social class is no social class. I'm in my own social class. I do whatever I want and no one bothers me. I don't get involved with politics or anything like that. It's almost saying, because so much is written about class in the UK, that you want us to say all that stuff just doesn't really apply to me. I want to distance myself from that official language of politics rather than find a place within it. We've got this term which I've used in some of my previous work to characterize kind of working class values, rugged individualism, which is to say, you know, people in these situations, they prize their individuality. That is to say, they prize the fact that it's been hard, but I found a way of dealing with that hardship and getting by. And a certain pride which comes from that sense of, you know, I've managed to make ends meet. I've managed to find a life despite all the difficulties. And I'm going to return to this theme in my last point, but here's a classic example. I've always been a grafter, never had that much money. Yeah, if you can read it quickly. I've never had a credit card. My wife's exactly the same. It's basically, if you want it, save for it. So a sense of pride, which comes from a sense of, you know, I've just had to deal with things by myself, and that's, you know, that's given me a sense of individual resilience almost, even amongst the lack of social support. Now, one thing we also did in the analysis, and here Cynthia Mearson, who's a lecturer at York University of York in North of England, she did this. She used a software package called QDA Minor, which is one of the various packages you can use to analyze text, to pull out the themes which come out of the material. And it's a fairly inductive approach. So the terms here, if you can read them, things like pressure and quite happy, trauma, come out of what people are saying. And again, what she was able to do she's able to contrast the narratives in blue from the Precarious interviews with the control group who were taken from the NCDS as a whole. And again, the point here is to say that there are some contrasts, but they're not as big as you might think. So in fact, if you look at the amount of reference to trauma, there's very little difference between the control group and the people in the Precariat. The biggest difference is this code called quite happy. And I should just say, so quite happy is a very interesting term. When I spent 2 years working in the US, and I realized in the US, when the word quite is used, it always means very. In English, in English, to say quite can often mean not very much or a bit happy. I'm not sure what it means in South Africa, but so when you're saying you're quite happy, you're sort of saying, well, I'm okay. I'm not really, really happy. I'm quite happy. sort of it's not disastrous. And that's one, interestingly, where the control group score higher than the Precariat subsample. And again, Cynthia, she mined down into the text and when there was a reference to quite happy in the text, she then began to look as to what text was around it to see the big themes. And this lists what they are. Interestingly, gender, it's really, really interesting. Women, particularly, often were really happy talking about being female. Men, not so much, for reasons we go into. But that came out. The area, being in the hospital, which sounds a bit counterintuitive, because one doesn't normally associate being in the hospital with being quite happy, I don't think. But anyway, making ends meet, plans for the future, and so on and so forth. So again, this is all showing that the in-depth interviews are showing resilience and capacity, and so forth. Now, final, by the time. But then what I did is so when you analyse text material, you can use coding to try and focus upon certain themes, or you can look at the interviews and really try and get to grips with what people are telling you. And one of the things which really struck me, looking at the interview material of the 20 interviewees who were in this precarious position, is just how many of them had a really hard life. And here, I'm just listing them, don't bother reading it in detail, except you might want to look at the right-hand column, because what was striking is out of these 20, a majority had a really traumatic life. And they were quite happy to do this, talk through some really major life issues. Divorce, experience of crime, violence, drugs, problems with the kids, husband being severely depressed, being sexually attacked, having chronically ill children, being seriously ill off work, being bullied at work, having an abusive father. It's just amazing how these kinds of accounts came out. And again, these were not, these did not come out of the panel survey. These would not have come out of the quantitative responses. And it's quite striking how many of them felt able to tell us these things. It perhaps reflects the fact that this sample are used to being interviewed in various ways, but nonetheless, and so I'm just flicking through these interviews now. There's a couple which I put in green here, which would very positive account of community life, but then there's all the other ones of caring responsibilities, an alcoholic mother, divorce, illness, husband severely ill, financial pressure, divorce, illness. So again, you're getting the sense, this comes over again and again, that the interpretation seems to be discrepant. On one hand, some of the survey responses are indicating these people feel, pretty positive. But when you actually get people to talk about their lives, you find, for many of the sample, these really quite traumatic issues and difficulties they've had to confront in their life. Interestingly, as you can see, these are all individual aspects of their life. So they are experienced as individual issues. Now, obviously, as we know as social scientists, that individual probabilities of any of these things are structured. So we know that being affected by crime or ill health or marital breakdown is linked into your social position. But the important thing is that these are experienced as individual issues. And what came out, this is the final point of the paper really, is to say that, of course, these people were all interviewed in 2008 when they were 50. So there's certain moments in their life. What came out of doing this detailed reading of the texts was how many of them gave an account of some kind of personal reconciliation. So basically the story was, I've had a real issue in my life, which, absolutely was awful, but somehow or other I have managed to deal with it. And this kind of account comes out on many occasions, and it involves an epiphany. So this notion of an epiphany is a turning point. The turning point is when you realize just how bad things are, and at that point you realize something has to be done about it. So that's also tied in with this notion of recovering agency. So normally it was an account of I just had this awful set of experiences and things were hopeless. And actually, I managed to recover my agency. And that's also linked into the sense of personal responsibility. And then often there's a discussion about, how a few really important people have been important supports. So what's really important here, I think, is it doesn't conform to any of the kind of standard cultural poverty ideas. The cultural poverty ideas that, people in these most disadvantaged situations are just hopeless. They're not making any effort. Just sort of, life is so grim. It's just a matter of getting by. That's not the kind of accounts which we got in these 50-year-olds. The kind of accounts we got were very thoughtful and very mature accounts of, dealing with hardship and finding a degree of personal reconciliation, despite it all. And I'm just going to talk very briefly about one of perhaps the most traumatic of all. This is a woman who had been pregnant at age 16, was forced to have the baby, I think, and then she split up with her husband, and then she met another guy when she was about 18, and then this guy began having an affair with her best friend, and then began beating her up. And she had an epiphany. Her epiphany was that her husband was beating her up, and her small son, was so desensitized to the violence that he wasn't bothered. He seemed to be playing with his toys without almost noticing what's happening. And that made her think, I can't carry on with this, I've got to leave. And then from that point, she recovers her sense of herself and her future. And the reason I've got this term of recovery of self is this sense about how people portray their lives as being passive versus active. So here the account is very much when she was young, her life was dictated to her by her situation. We shared a flat which was his flat. It was somewhere that I never felt that was my own. And then when we got divorced, he gave me the deposit on a flat. It's all, things being done to her. And then you get in this account a sense of reclaiming agency. So firstly, she was talking about when she was pregnant at 16, Dad came over, so Dad did all the sorting things out. He wasn't very happy. Both agreed that I should have an abortion. I was 16. A 16-year-old didn't have a lot of say. And my mum said I had to keep the baby. She did keep the baby. And then she talks in the second quote here about her first husband, how she left her first husband, and about basically how she just decided she has to leave one day and leave the kid at school. And she just knew her neighbour would pick up the kid. But the point is that she then talks about, I haven't actually got a good quote here, but she then talks about how later on she came to a decision to leave the abusive relationship and move on in her life. So hope you've got a sense there about why I think this matters, because I think the individual accounts are giving us a sense about agency and about how even in the most difficult situations, and let's not forget, these people are all 50 years old. I think there was a life course history. It'd be difficult to be people are 30 or 25 or 40 or 70 or whatever. At that age, many of these people are able to give an account of having a political reconciliation. I'm going to skip over this, we haven't got time. Okay, quickly, conclusions. So, hope it's been useful. I recognise it's a very distinctive study, but I hope what I've tried to indicate is the value of reconciling macro structural accounts versus experiential accounts, and why you've got to do this if we're to understand how people are making sense of their lives and how they might be thinking about making changes and doing certain things and engaging in certain kinds of practices. Qualitative methods, I think, are really, so getting in-depth interviews rather than survey responses, very important for eliciting narratives which, are difficult narratives, are challenging narratives. Often it's the form of what people say rather than the content, which is telling. So by the form, I mean, it's the kind of the way in which people narrate an epiphany of a turning point in their life, which comes over, rather than the actual content of what they say. And the fact that it can be discrepant to see what the survey sources are telling us versus the in-depth interview is actually something which I think is very revealing as to kind of how different sorts of stories can be reconciled. And so just on the substantive implications before I finish, I mean, so what I'll try to show is that, you know, we have an approach about understanding precarity from macro-based survey quantitative methods, which are, you know, things are really, you know, structurally very difficult, very poor material conditions, people really having a really hard life. Now, the actual experiences we get, sure, in some ways they reinforce that, as I've tried to indicate, but they also talk about the resilience and the kind of agency people can show, even in those situations. And if we're to understand, if we try to understand why people might change their practices or develop a new strategy in their life, understanding that is important. What is really striking is the way in which I think these precarious individuals, they very rarely talked about political parties or politics offering them support. For them, their hope for the future and their ability to reach personal reconciliation in their lives was not to do with that world. It was to do with their own family, friends, and their individual capacity. And that therefore helps explain why they weren't really directly involved in politics and thought politics was a waste of time, and why, in a sense, they might be attracted towards a populist political worldview. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Stop sharing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mike. That was very, very interesting and thoughtful. The way that we would like to run the Q&A session is that I'm just going to wrap up a few points and we'll then invite Shiona for some comments because she's also read your paper. And while we're talking, I would like to invite everyone to gather their thoughts and questions, and we'll look into the list. So please raise your hand and then we'll go through whoever's raised their hand. Great. So I think it was a wonderful illustration of how to link the bigger picture to the individual story that almost breaks your heart once you look into it. And a good reminder to be aware of prejudice and assumptions and not bias yourself into what you think. So it's very useful to have these panel data. I hope that in the countries that we'll be studying under TSITICA, we can also find similar clues that will be similarly helpful to understand livelihood changes and so forth. So what I thought was particularly interesting were basically 3 points from the project's perspective. So to look, so when you showed your findings about the belief in meritocracy and how it actually didn't correspond at all, no, with the income curve. I just wondered if you could track that to the impacts of different events, and also that this kind of analysis is quite useful to also see the impact of events, and these could be climate events on livelihoods and how they change people's beliefs about the world, about recovery and so forth, because that's a lot of the things that we were looking at. And you know, what I also thought was particularly interesting is that representation in political processes and basically the withdrawal from it because of the bias in the political system towards the upper classes and representation thereof, that which in itself are also an assumption, right, of yeah, they might confirm, but it's not necessarily confirmed. Yeah, and then overall understanding the vulnerabilities of livelihoods to major events, may they be climate or otherwise stimulated. So I thought that would be really interesting. And yeah, a bit, I mean, great to see the point of agency that you can, you know, find in these stories once you start digging. But then also see that there's basically a whole group of loners in a way that they don't seem to have a structure of supports and basically falling through the cracks and building resilience alone or based on family and some sort of structure that might be implicitly there but not explicit. Yes. Yeah, so these are my points. If you want to respond, then Shiona, did you want to come on?
Hi everyone, thanks Britta, and thanks Mike for a great presentation. I must admit, when I first read the paper, I panicked a little bit and thought, this is really way beyond me, but having sort of read it again and heard the talk, I feel actually quite comfortable with what I've heard. So Britta asked me to reflect a little bit on the kind of take-homes from your talk for the TSITICA project, and I think in particular Work Package 4. So Work Package 4 is the work package that's actually doing the on-the-ground work to look at the impacts or the outcomes of climate change interventions or climate actions, both on climate risk, but also in terms of poverty and inequality. So we have to be looking at those two dimensions in Work Package 4.
Yes.
So I think what came from your talk is obviously the value of the qualitative research. So we're definitely going to take a mixed methods approach. But I think what you've highlighted is, I almost feel we should bias towards the qualitative almost more than the quantitative on the ground, in looking at the impacts of climate change. So, what is clear is the qualitative accounts or narratives can help us, explore the perspectives, attitudes, and worldviews of different respondents. And I think providing a look into their lives, but also a relational understanding of how they relate to others, but I think also how they relate to their own circumstances or how they relate to the changes that they're seeing and experiencing in their environment. And your little visualization figures, I think actually could be really interesting to do something similar to how people have experienced changes in their environment, in their landscapes, in the weather, and how that's actually also impacted on their livelihoods. So the use of these kind of visualization tools, and I really like that one because it was quite simple, but also like the fact people could draw their own. So I think there's some lessons there as well from what you shared. And also this idea of, agency versus, structure, and agency and experience. I think question for us is, in our work on the ground, is do we select who we think might be the most vulnerable or marginalized people, particularly in terms of risk to, from climate change, or do we go for a bigger sample and actually look across the board and do some comparison? So that was a kind of question I had that maybe we could reflect on. I see not everyone here is from the TSITICA project, but there are quite a large group of people from that project. And then the other part I thought was really interesting is when you were able to look at your sample against the bigger cohort. And again, I was wondering in the TSITICA project if there's an option to compare the people that we interview, who they are, against a bigger regional sample, and what some of the changes might have been then potentially from the climate action. And then the other part I thought was quite interesting is how you can sort of, I don't want to use the word test, but reflect on the theory based on what is coming out in the interviews. And one of our entry points for our work will be transformation, thinking about transformative adaptation, and how can we use what we see in the interviews to reflect on that as well. I thought it was something that would be worth thinking about quite a lot more. I wrote down a lot of notes, but I think that was most of it. So thank you very much for those insights. And I do feel there's a lot more parallels than one would originally think in terms of what you presented and what we're doing in our project. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you. Let me reply quickly to Britta and to you, Shona. And let me be quite honest, again, for me, this is also a great project because I've always been interested in the climate change issue, but never done any research with climate change researchers. And so it's a really, I'm just really looking forward to the dialogues and thinking about how there may be some resonances whilst being quite honest, I don't know much about the climate change side of things. I'm much more on the inequality side of things. But I do think, and it does seem to me that one of the challenges inequality research poses to the climate change discussion is about looking at the top end of the distribution. Because the top end of the distribution, if you like, the wealthy and the rich have done in many societies, and that would certainly include South Africa, have done really well. I mean, they've actually absolutely pulled ahead. But as people like Piketty in his new book and Lucas Chancel have argued, in some ways that grouping are in many respects the big problem. I mean, they're the ones who are leaving a huge carbon imprint, living in massive houses, driving many cars, having private jets and things. But of course, the interesting thing is, I suspect, this is a version of the kind of paradox that if you actually interview those people in depth, they would give you a strong account of how they're incredibly climate aware and environmentally conscious. So, you know, and it would probably go down not just to the top 1%, but to the kind of the upper middle class. The middle class is comfortably off, who would be the people who probably have a very good account of how they're trying to make a difference and how they're thinking seriously about trying to improve their environmental footprint, are the ones who actually structurally are causing them all the problems. And so, again, if it's a matter of reflecting upon those discrepancies, this could be quite an interesting thing to do in linking the climate change with the inequality debate. And again, I mean, there are some, I think, with my involvement in the project, there are some resources to do some in-depth interviews and do some qualitative work. And I'm very open-minded about how we do this in the project. But I think using, Shiona, you mentioned using the visualizations, the life count of your life trajectories, which could possibly be adapted somehow to talk about people's, experience of climate issues, how they see the future of the world, in terms of, that would be something which would appeal to me. And I'd be very interested in thinking about how we might do that. And similarly too, it links to your point, Britta, about politics and how the political environment shapes views in meritocracy. I mean, going back to the British case, beliefs in meritocracy declined in the 80s. Still high, but it declined a bit. And that was when Thatcher, we had the Thatcher government, which had made a big pitch about, stripping back the state, developing, marketising, the economy, privatisation and so forth. And my suspicion is that many of that tip would have been caused by people who didn't like Thatcher. And since we're on the left and we're using it now to realise, well, they wanted to register the fact that they did not sign up to that meritocratic view as a means of resisting that Thatcherite agenda. Now, when things move on in the 90s and the noughties, and that neoliberal agenda isn't quite as obvious, and I think people may be much more likely to default back to a kind of a general endorsement of meritocracy. That does make us realise. So I think politics is there, and again, I think the issue of climate change is important in terms of how people view the world of policy intervention, given that a lot of the key developments come from governments and there are strategies to try and improve environmental issues. Understanding how people are responding to the very idea of government-led initiatives is very important, I think, whether they lead to kickbacks or negative responses. So I think I think it could be an interesting issue there. But I would underscore the fact, which again, as I was saying, is I think a really important understanding British politics currently is just the degree to which government intervention is seen to be a problem. So how many people, at the bottom end particularly, just feel alien to government. They feel alien to the state. And well-intended attempts by the state to try and improve things could have counterproductive, they could go the opposite direction, because people just feel these are being done by people who don't represent our interests. This is the story behind Brexit. It's the story behind the reason why the Conservative Party being so successful. And it's kind of concerning to us, because we obviously believe in policy, well-intentioned policy making a difference. But if a large chunk of people don't like the idea of top-down policy, there's a real issue about how we try and ensure they are engaged with the process and don't write it off as being, here's another bunch of out-of-touch experts projecting something on us. So just there's a few thoughts.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, there's also the whole dimension of the just transition and job losses, especially in like established sectors like coal and so forth. I would like to invite for questions if there are any hands coming up, or if you don't find the hands up button, then you can just speak now. Are there any questions?
Can I just ask another question, Britta, please?
Yes, sure.
So, you know, one of the aspects I was thinking about in the narratives is almost a sort of life history of, you know, how people's lives were, say when they were younger, how they've changed with time, particularly due to aspects, for example, of climate change or other related stresses on people's livelihoods. And when the project came in, were there any changes then again? So, you know, so really trying to look at some sort of attribution from the project and how it's impacted on people's lives or their livelihoods. So would that be possible to do with this type of, you know, interview, actually try and look at those changes and then almost have that point in time where the climate intervention came in and say, you know, have you noticed any other further changes from then? And maybe that would also differ between, you know, different types of people, different groupings in the community.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, and certainly, obviously one possibility would be to do some panel interviews, you know, with the same people over a period of time, before and after some policy intervention. Actually, one project I should mention, but you know, it's actually very relevant to the climate change, to this side of our work, is a project which I was marginally involved with a number of years ago. But it was led by transport engineers and by some sociologists in the north of England, University of Manchester and University of Leeds. And they were interested precisely in this. So they were very much interested in equitable transportation, sustainable transportation, and how you might persuade people not to drive the car, but to cycle or to run or whatever. And their design was very much sort of a qualitative panel survey, in which they would trace the same people through over 5 years to see how they were, and then you could identify some people who made a change in their transportation habits, you know, by moving towards some kind of more sustainable forms of transport. The reason I'm saying this is, so I think it's a very interesting project, which would actually, some design like this, we've got 3 years, haven't we? But less than 3 years now. No, you could do some interesting things around that. And you've got some time, some reasonable time scale for us to look at transitions. So the problem with the project at Leeds and Manchester was that they collected so much data they didn't know how to analyse. They got these I think about 1,000 panel surveys, people over 3 years. But I think the methodology would be interesting to think about. And the point you made, Britta, about just transition. That notion of transition, it could fit into this notion of an epiphany. When did you realise? Some people will have realised, I've got to do something differently. Or, you know, an important thing happened, you know, important policy intervention, or an important idea, or, you know, I read a book or something on TV, and it would be interesting to think about, can people narrate particular sort of news stories or events which cause them to think about making a transition in their own life, which could then match on to bigger macro transitions towards climate awareness and such like. So that would be very interesting, I think.
Yeah, I agree also in terms of the concept of intersectionality, no? In terms of different
Yes.
inequalities perpetuating themselves, and especially in South Africa, there is the regional inequalities. So the mining sites are in the poorest areas and so forth. So now, if that goes, what's going to be left? And there's a lot of that sort of discourse.
Yes.
Which would be also interesting to look more closely.
Yes, yes, I agree.
Yeah, and then I was also thinking it would be interesting to screen the panel data that you have, colleagues in South Africa, Ghana, and Kenya, to see if there are any clues for vulnerabilities for livelihoods, and where potentially one could dig a bit deeper in terms of qualitative interviews, no? As a takeaway. I still haven't seen anybody find the raise hand button, but Murray is up, right?
Thanks,
Murray?
I can't put up my hand.
Yeah, that's
oh,
fine.
I can. Anyway, yeah, fantastic talk. Thank you, Mike. And obviously, so certainly for those that use the panel data with any nuance, who are also involved in civil society and things, understand that maybe the best that you can do with the panel data and with the dynamic quantitative analysis is to be clear about the sort of the limitations or the sphere, the limits on what's possible, or so without either attributing a sort of a culture of, well, whatever you called it, where people are just sort of completely trapped with no degrees of freedom, and
yes.
which complete, but it can do quite a good job of sketching how a society actually works in what you're calling the structural aspects of it, but giving it some sort of detail.
Yes.
And so how access to land, or how this or how that, things that are quite important to TSITICA.
Yes. Is it me? Have I frozen, or is Murray?
I think Murray actually froze.
No.
Did you catch the question?
No.
Yes, didn't reach the question yet. Yeah, so at least the two of us are still here. I don't know if anyone else is. Maybe.
Yeah. I'm still, yeah.
Okay, good.
I'm still here as well.
Good. Yeah, any other thoughts? There's many Murray Lebrans, that's true. Maybe another Murray would like to come forth. Murray, are you back?
Yes, I'm back. I don't know whether my machine was censoring me or what.
No, we lost you, but you can continue, please.
Okay, so all I'm wondering about then is whether one, adding the sort of the vignettes and the resilience and the actual agency, which is obviously crucial, and if you've worked with anybody, there's an enormous dignity in just surviving,
Yes. Yes.
But whether one can actually follow methodologies that make that tractable, that we can take back in, the grand agenda of the TSITICA project is at the end of the day, we're going to be able to say something back into the policy space.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that's the question or the issue.
Yes. I mean, I think absolutely, it's a big issue, and it's going to be challenging. I do think if there's a way of unpicking how individuals in their own lives have made changes, so it goes back to this issue about some of these individuals I talked to,
right,
get account of how they recovered agency. And if we think about that with respect to climate change, then that could be useful for, showing to policymakers, we have shown that in certain situations, people want to make a difference in their own lifestyles and their own practices, which could be useful to shifting the agenda. So I can see it would be interesting. Can I ask you, Murray? I think we've had this conversation before, but presumably it's not possible to subsample from your panel survey in South Africa. You wouldn't be able to draw a qualitative subsample from it, or might you be able to?
Probably not. It hasn't been possible before. because it's a national instrument funded by government and anything. So they've been very wary about that.
Yes.
Just in terms of protecting the panel.
Yes.
But there's all sorts of clever ways of thinking about doing things in parallel, in a sense.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Shiona's got her hands up. Shiona, do you want to come in?
Just the conversation we're having now sort of has made me think, you know, maybe something to come out of this project, maybe a bit of lobbying or advocacy work, is to try and get some qualitative data into our national surveys. Because if you look at the, you know, Department of Environment Affairs or DEF, no, from the environment side, monitoring of adaptation is a big issue. There's all sorts of proposals, and there's been quite a lot of work recently looking at how, you know, what should a monitoring and evaluation scheme look like. But without that data, it's really hard. So I think a really important outcome of this project could be, what kind of data do we need to include in national surveys to get a better handle on how people are vulnerable to, responding to, you know, coping or adapting to climate change? And part of that could be this more qualitative work that actually takes in those, you know, aspects of how people are dealing with it, coping, what their agency is, how they're changing, what they're doing, etc. Because we just don't have that data. And I've argued for a long time we need much more longitudinal livelihood data, particularly with the amount of change that's happening at the moment. And it's going to be the only way in the long term to track what is happening. So maybe that's just something that we can try and push for out of this project at the end.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, definitely. That's a very interesting point. Also thinking of events, no, like the drought has impacted, and those who live in Cape Town has basically impacted everybody, but at very different nuances. So it's definitely something worth looking into. Mike, did you want to respond to Shiona?
No, I mean, well, obviously I'm not familiar with the South African situation, but I can absolutely believe that. And I mean, in the UK context, it's difficult to get qualitative data into the policy arena, just as it is in many places. Having said that, when it's done well, it can add a kind of a richness which the media can understand it, politicians can pick up upon it. So if you can do it skillfully, it can actually, you know, be a very powerful tool to, you know, increase the take-up of your work, given that, you know, sophisticated quantitative analyses, you know, need to be read by experts, and you're going to miss the kind of other audiences, including politicians these days, who are not necessarily trained in that. So it's definitely worth thinking about.
Can I make another point?
Yes, please go ahead.
Sure. So, I mean, one of the obvious areas I think where this is enormously valuable is on the issues of gender.
Yes.
Gender, households, and community, if you like. Trying to put together the package. The fact that surveys are sampled by household or by individual or whatever doesn't mean that that's how life actually works.
Yes.
Just understanding those relations are so important in any African context I can think about. They're absolutely crucial. And it seems to me you offer a lot, or this sort of mix. Yeah.
So in the South African surveys, you take a household member, which could be male or female or whatever, but you don't necessarily triangulate with other household members, I guess. Is that what you're saying, Mary?
No. The particular survey that I've been involved in has quite a rich. It's an individual panel, but it constructs the household in quite a complicated way around wherever they're living at each point in time. You put together the household with some detail around them and the community that they're living in around them.
Okay.
And you can locate them, relating to the discussion we were having earlier, you can locate them in a community using your spatial mapping.
Right.
But that's not, it's very hard to, so that's very useful, but it doesn't get at the social relations that are at work.
No.
It's very hard to get at any of that.
No, that's absolutely right. Yeah. Yes, you miss those household dynamics, which as my own case study showed, are often very, very important in people's accounts of themselves and where they fit and get missed out. Yeah. Good.
Shona,
The links between gender and land, say, and households and communities, and how's it actually working, would be particularly important for this project.
Yes, that would be interesting. I agree.
Cool. Any other questions for Mike? If not, I would really like to thank you. It's been really inspiring, and I think we will have lots more questions on how to make this work. But it definitely, I think it brought the learning that we were expecting. I think we all understand panel data a lot better, and how to actually dig into them and what they can offer at the qualitative level as well. So well done, and thank you very much.
Okay. Well, please make contact. Email me if anyone wants to ask any more questions. And I've got a paper I can share with anyone who's interested. Yeah, and we can also share that through our communications crowd. You can email TSITICA project. Okay, brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.